Yes, I'm Stuart Muir. I'm executive director of a little think tank communications group based out of Vancouver called ResourceWorks, nonprofit society. Everything these two have said, I thoroughly agree with. The innovation problem, the understanding of that is a matter, I think, of state security and prosperity for Canada. Right now, that's at risk. And I would add that it's no accident that innovation is not understood as being a driver of energy and vice versa. It's a complex dynamic. It's good for Canada. It is what makes us prosperous as we are. However, there are motivated movements that are seeking to displace the truth of energy and innovation in Canada for political and social and cultural agendas that are inimical with the prosperity and state security of Canada. And it is approaching crisis levels for this country. I'm very, very concerned. And that's really why I've started coming to Manning this year for the first time.
Okay. Martha.
Martha O'Finley, President and CEO of the Canada West Foundation. And three quick points. One, I did an interview yesterday and was asked about the Prime Minister's trip to California, the Silicon Valley. You know, he's there partly in discussions about NAFTA, but also to encourage American businesses to support the continuation of NAFTA, which is great, but also there to attract investment from Silicon Valley. And it's so frustrating because, you know, what you've mentioned, and Jeff, the level of technology, when we talk about the high-tech sector, he wants to build the high-tech sector. The high-tech world is not a sector. High-tech is used in all of the other sectors. And so for us, especially in Canada West, and we represent, for the most part, the interests of the 4 Western provinces, it's not just energy, it's agriculture, it's ag-food, it's food processing, it's forestry, it's fisheries. I mean, it's extraordinary just how much technology and R&D and science is going into those sectors that, frankly, too many people in this country don't understand. So that's one. Two, the situation right now in terms of NAFTA is very, very different from when it was when we negotiated that agreement. When we negotiated that agreement, the United States needed our energy. In fact, we had significant leverage in that negotiation because they needed our energy. They were very concerned about energy security, and they knew that they were going to get it with Canadian oil and gas. Well, fast forward a couple of decades, and it's turned 180 degrees. The shale revolution in the United States has allowed abundant and relatively inexpensive and easily ramped up or down, not easily, but a lot more easily than some of our sources, has changed the tables around completely. So now, not only are the United States not dependent on our oil and gas, they're now exporting oil, and they are competing with us. And so all of a sudden, we have a double whammy. One, they're competing with us in terms of exports. They don't need our resources as much as they do. And for anybody in this room who doesn't realize, when we hear a quote that the price of oil is at, I don't know what it is today, but $62 a barrel. Last week, the differential was $32. That means the Americans are now getting our oil at, in effect, half price. They benefit. We don't. And that's another story that is really important in terms of technology. So bringing it back to technology, the industry is going gangbusters to reduce our greenhouse gas emission footprint for our energy, and achieving some extraordinary successes, actually, going from those big, bad, ugly, dirty tar sands to, I think now the new Suncor production, Jeff, you'd know better, but I think the Fort Hills, the average footprint for a barrel out of that is now less than the average North American barrel. Well, isn't that interesting? All of a sudden, thanks to technology and innovation, Canadian oil is well on its way to actually being seen to be clean, if given who we're trying to persuade. But I think that's very interesting. I think I said I had 3 points, but I think I brought the third one into those too. So there you go.
You did the third point. You just forgot to say 3 in front of it.
Enough to get the conversation going.
Good. Okay, Shannon.
I'm Shannon Stubbs. I'm the Natural Resources Shadow Minister. Hi, Alan, nice to see you. From Lakeland, Alberta, so I represent a big rural riding in northeast Alberta. And the communities and the local economies are fueled by oil and gas and heavy oil development. Just for context for my background, I spent the bulk of my professional career in the Alberta government in the Department of Energy in the oil sands business unit at a time just when the in situ development was starting to take off. So I have a very keen sensitivity towards the way in which public policy can impact and help to spur the development of innovative technologies. And as a conservative, of course, you'd forgive me for usually being skeptical and tending to err towards the assumption that government sometimes can do more harm than good and most often should stay out of the way. But in terms of the development of the oil sands and the spurring of in situ development, through which the vast majority of the resource will be recovered, part of it, that was in part a combination of industry's innovation, partnered with research and with academic institutions, but also at that time, I think this is fair to say, to give some credit to the Chrétien Liberals at the time.
It's okay.
Yeah, a willingness between, Ralph Klein's progressive conservative government in Alberta and Jean Chrétien's Liberal government in Ottawa to bring together both, accelerated capital cost allowances for in situ development in combination with a royalty regime that triggered investment in these in situ projects, which are the future of the industry. And in that case, that worked, right? And then anyway, after that, I spent a little while in the International Office and Trade Division in Alberta's Department of Economic Development, helping promote internationally Alberta's heavy oil and oil sands surface supply technology expertise. So I am very passionate about Alberta and Canada as a world leader in responsible energy development, as an incubator of innovation, technology, and regulatory expertise that, as Jeff mentioned, I think it's actually our moral responsibility to play that role in the world as energy demands continue to grow. And I'm very concerned, I think we'll get into this in the discussion, but over the past couple of years about, at least I perceive, policy and legislative frameworks and decisions by the federal and provincial levels of government being driven by an anti-energy agenda which is not fact-based, not based on science, and which, for example, in the case of Indigenous communities and people, they are tilting the narrative around energy development in Canada in a way that is just not factual. So, I would just mention, in my view, the left spins a narrative that Indigenous people are the vast majority are against oil and gas and pipelines. That is not at all the case among the Indigenous communities that I represent in Lakeland. Almost all who are involved as significant partners in oil and gas, and we can get into some of the other initiatives that government decisions are actually blocking various Indigenous-owned initiatives in energy development. And, also this narrative that suggests that only since the election of the federal Liberal government and maybe only since the election of the NDP government in Alberta has, for example, consultation with Indigenous or impacted communities on energy projects been done, or impact assessments on energy projects, or economic, environmental, and safety assessments, which have all been hallmarks of Canada's regulatory system. And so I think it's incumbent on elected representatives in Canada to make clear that energy development underpins the Canadian economy as the largest private sector investor in Canada and Canada's second biggest export, that it is an industry of the future, and that it supports Canada in playing a powerful and needed role to supply the world's growing energy needs.
Okay. Well, as you can see from the panel, we have a very diverse set of views of pro-energy. So what I'd like to do is in the discussion is try to maybe bring out some of the issues from other people's points of views and see what our pro-energy panel thinks of why they think that way, and maybe I do business in Quebec, and I think there's a lot of very well-meaning, heartfelt people that really want to improve the world, and I don't think that they're all wrong, and so I'd like to try to bring some of that out in basically two categories as we've got right here. One is to talk about demand and transition for just a little bit, and then also get some views then on innovation, and after that, maybe just open it up to the floor for some questions. But just starting with the demand and transition, and you talked, we've always been in transition, but what we know that people mean by transition, they ultimately mean leaving some or all of our oil in the ground. And I'll just pass on, with or without permission from Jeff at CAP, because I'm on the Board of Governors there, some polling information. And what we find is that there's a strong majority of Canadians who believe that the Canadian energy industry is good, that the Canadian energy industry is important and it's delivering value. But I know that you start to talk to Canadians about, and how do you feel about us continuing to use oil 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now? That support diminishes extremely quickly. So we have a view in the public of, yes, oil and gas is important and it's good and we support it as a Canadian industry, but we also have that view that if you're telling me that we'll still be producing in 50 years, I'm not in. So I want to just talk about why is there such a strong, in the public, and not in this panel, but in the public, why is there this strong view that energy transition, leave oil in the ground one day, is a good idea?
Well, you know, it's difficult to say why people come to that kind of conclusion. I think that they have been sold that it's very easy to substitute energy, that I can just, I can get off oil and I can drive my car with electricity, and that I can heat my home with unicorn power and everything will be fine. But it won't be affordable, it won't be reliable, and it won't be sustainable. I think really what you see with Canadians is they do have a concern about impact on the environment and what's the world going to bring. And I think it does surprise Canadians just how innovative this industry is, just how high-tech this industry is. When you can have a guy sitting on the 21st floor in a tower in Calgary, working on his laptop, drilling a well 5 kilometers underground in Colorado with his finger on his laptop, you can't tell me that this industry isn't high-tech and innovative. But I think when people look at energy demand, they look in their own lives and they realize the efficiencies that we have made as individual consumers and as a society have been substantive, and therefore they extrapolate. Therefore, there will be a day without oil. Well, they said the same thing when radio came and said there'll be no more newspapers, when TV came and said there'll be no more radio, when the internet came and said there'll be no more other form of media. The fact of the matter is the world is growing at such a magnitude and at such a pace that we will need every single source of energy. And as I said earlier, our energy mix here in Canada may change. We may have the opportunity to electrify a lot more of our systems than we currently do today. But that's not going to be the case around the world. When you look around the world, we're going to add another China in terms of almost 2 billion people in the next 20, 25 years. That's the equivalent of adding the city of Shanghai to the world, all those people, all that energy demand, every 4 months for the next 25 years. So we're going to need all of the above when it comes to energy options. And thankfully, because of energy efficiency led by innovations like our sector and others, has helped, because the growing demand around the world for energy is actually, the real demand is 60% growth. But energy efficiency is going to help us diminish that in half. So the world's still going to need way more energy into the future, and it's still going to need it from oil and from natural gas. And I think the more that people understand that their efficiency and their consumption can change, that their mix at home can change, but we live in a growing world and a growing connected world that's going to need every single natural resource that we have.
Stuart, you're from BC. What do you think? Do you think that energy transition not just yet, or do you think energy transition never? And what do you think people in BC think?
Well, we've done some polling
In the
on
mainland.
this.
I want to specifically talk about right there in Vancouver.
Mainland and Victoria, for sure. Definitely an urban-rural divide, significant in our political landscape. We've done some polling. Broadly speaking, British Columbians, like most Canadians, are very supportive of the resource economy. 85% of people in BC agree that it is going to be a long-term part and desirable part of our economy. But when you start to drill into that a little bit, that's where you get some frictions. Less than 60% of people think that innovation is part of our natural resource story. And that's a terrible thing, because as those of us on the stage all have shown you, there's abundant evidence that innovation is the very heart of our modern, sustainable, long-term resource economy. just in the last, Jeff, you mentioned a China stat. Here's my China stat. Just in the last 5 years, China has expanded its crude oil imports by an amount equal to the entire production of the Canadian oil and gas crude oil sector.
Right.
Just in 5 years. So in another 5 years, there'll be another Canada added. So there's these population dynamics as well as consumption. I have a slide. Elena, are you able to get it up there?
Here.
Yeah, it's
It's
already
up
there.
above your head.
So there's a picture from the news last week. You might have seen Elon Musk set another big vessel into space with a car attached to it. And that means that because it's headed for Mars, the first planet in the galaxy that will be 100% electric for cars will be Mars. Now, Earth is different. And if you look at the data below that, this is from the Energy Information Agency of the United States. Now, this data, by the way, it's not Trump-era data. This is continuous data research for years and years back into previous eras. So this is the good stuff. It just came out this week. It's fresh. And that darker blue, the Tory blue part of it, gasoline, or is that a little bit greenish?
This might be your first time at the Manning Conference, but I thought that was quite good.
Yeah, I thought so too. Nice slide in there.
You can see for yourselves, up to 2050, the amount of gasoline consumed in the United States is going to be about the same as it is now. It's going to dip a little bit, you can see it, then it's going to go up. And what does that tell us? It tells us that we know population's growing, people are going to be driving cars. They're probably going to be driving the same number of cars, but they're going to be driving way more efficient cars. And that's one of the great misconceptions about the electric car thing, is that there's a whole discourse on this, and not getting into the whole argument. I did an op-ed, if you search my name and electric cars, you'd find it, where I think the public has not been questioning this. Rather, they've been seeing the marketing for these shiny new things from Tesla, which are heavily subsidized, require cobalt that is mined by children in Africa,
Exactly.
and is very limited in its potential supply. To replace the current vehicular fleet with electric cars today would require twice as much cobalt as is known to exist in the world. So how we do that, I'm not sure, and no one's telling me. Yet our federal government is telling all of its senior people to drive electric cars and hybrids and things. Hey, I'm all for hybrids, but electric cars, I think if the city of Victoria, where I live, is importing a bus from China, an electric bus for about $1 million, 4 times a nice Canadian-made, Winnipeg-made bus, to solve a problem it doesn't have, which is air pollution, using a technology to solve a problem that Beijing does have, which is air pollution, so that we can feel good about that. And my tax dollars as a homeowner are supporting that. I seem to be the only one in Victoria asking, are we sure this is a good idea? And so I think we need more people, whether they're running for office or doing policy or just citizens asking the right people these questions, to look at the reality of this data set here and say, well, wait a minute, the Tesla glam marketing is not consistent with the data we're seeing from credible sources on the energy future. What's going on? Nobody is asking this. Nobody. And it's about time that changed.
So just because we're going to go downtown Calgary next, and what I'm hearing is transition not realistic and not possible, right? That's what you said. That's what you're saying. So in downtown Calgary, we've got a lot of big companies, from Shell to Repsol to BP to Beyond Petroleum, and all these companies who are all telling us that they're actually going to be these new age companies, and that they're on transition and they're on it soon. So if it's not possible, why do we have oil companies in Calgary telling us it not only is it possible, but we're doing it now?
Well, I think a couple of things. It is really important for folks in the industry to recognize that there are a lot of people who are anti-pipeline, who are talking about this transition required, that unicorns warming our houses. They don't say it quite like that. But I think it's really important to recognize, and an awful lot of those people mean well. There is an awful lot of passion out there for the environment. There are a lot of people who are really concerned about climate change. There are those of us who believe that yes, climate change is an issue, and so yes, a price on carbon is actually the most efficient, most cost-effective way to deal with it if you actually want to use the market to change that. That's a whole other discussion. But I think the first thing that's really important is to respect that an awful lot of people are coming to the table with real concerns and real passion. What we are saying is that there are actually two transitions, and it's partly in order to address that. There's the Canadian transition, but then there's the global transition. And it's great if Canadians want to cut back their consumption. I think it's great if Canadians want to drive an electric car. Well, maybe not in Alberta, because it actually is dirtier than a gas car because of where the electricity comes from right now. But if you want to drive an electric car in Quebec or in Ontario, that's great, that's fantastic. And I think there's a lot of pride. Canadians want to be seen, a lot of Canadians want to be seen to be doing everything they can in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But the other, and certainly in our, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of our own extraction processes, we're also getting really good. So we're really working hard as a country in our Canadian transition to a lower emission economy. We're all over that, that's fantastic. But the rest of the world is a very different story. And that's the part that we find so frustrating that doesn't get out, is that we can do everything we can here as Canadians to reduce our own emissions. But the rest of the world is going to continue to need fossil fuels for a long time to come. Is it 20 years? Is it 15? Is it 50? But every projection, and yes, even the ones that keep changing, but there is going to be a lot of demand for what we supply. And yes, if we get better at reducing our footprint for what we supply, that's fantastic. But it's actually so frustrating, because if the world's going to be using this stuff, why on earth shouldn't we encourage Canadians to supply it, right? And it's not, people say, well, that's like the tobacco argument. I said, no, it's actually not like the tobacco argument. The argument here, that well, just because people are going to smoke, it's okay. Well, the tobacco companies ended up, as we all know, working very hard to persuade people that smoking was okay, actually, encouraging, if you will, the addiction. And that's a very different problem. But in my view, if people are concerned about consumption around the world, then, talk about the divestment movement. Well, divest from Ford, divestment from General Motors. Don't go after the people who are doing what they can to supply the product that the rest of the world needs. And just a final piece of this, we can get up on our hind legs and with this moralistic tone say to people in China and India, we understand that you have huge energy demands, but you should actually be reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, without recognizing that for them to do that versus using readily available and inexpensive fossil fuels is a little rich for us to be able to say that. Yeah. It is far, far less expensive right now for so many parts in the world to continue to use fossil fuels. Our job as Canadians, we need to reduce our footprint as much as possible, totally get that. But we're in a position to provide something that's so important to the rest of the world. And as I said earlier, if we can do it with even fewer emissions, that's actually a contribution as opposed to making things worse.
Right. Okay. I'm going to try to do a quick little transition to get to you, but I'm just going to, one of the things that you hear people talk about, the Stone Age didn't run out of stone, and the oil age is not going to run because we run out of oil, we need to move on and transition. But just to Jeff's point, what I've noticed is that the Stone Age ended a long time ago, but if you go down to downtown Manhattan, I noticed they use a lot of stone today, building buildings and so on and so forth. So just because the Stone Age ends doesn't mean you stop using stone, and just because the coal age ended doesn't mean we stopped using coal. In fact, we use more coal today than we did when the coal age ended, and I think the oil age has already ended. I think we're into a gas age, but we're still going to use more oil, and I think we'll ultimately get to a solar age, and we'll still use more gas. So it's not a question of that you stop using any of these products because you get to a new age. It's what you said, you keep adding on and improving and changing your mix.
Yeah,
and if I can add just one point to that, Michael, I mean, when you look around the world, in the International Energy Agency, which looks all around the world at supply and demand, it even forecasts that with the growth of the electric car, which there are about 2 million units around the world today, growing to 280 million units, even with that, the world will still need more oil. So there is no simple answer that poof, it goes away.
So let's talk, but Shannon, can I switch it?
I want to switch it. Canadian context.
Right.
Like, I think it was in the 2015-2016 fiscal year, of the $2 billion in Canada that was spent on clean tech, $1.5 billion came from conventional oil and gas companies, pipeline companies in Canada. And, here's what I'm concerned about, that the narrative is as if it's environment versus energy, which in the Canadian context is wrong. the responsible energy development in Canada is linked with, inextricably with environmental stewardship, with reducing emissions, with more effective ways of managing water use, that it is both a competitive imperative for oil and gas developers in Canada. They have a long track record of doing that already. They will continue to do that in the future. That's something about which we should all be proud. So I think the narrative too that, the development of renewable alternative energy technologies in the future is somehow, and sort of to both of your points, is somehow in conflict with continuing oil and gas and oil sands development in Canada is completely incorrect, because in fact, you mentioned, many of these technologies, when you remove the heavy public subsidization, what you find in the Canadian context is that among the major private sector investors in the development of alternative and renewable energy is in the private sector is Canadian oil and gas pipelines and utility companies.
Right.
So these, in the Canadian context, this is a continuum. And I think for public policymakers and for elected representatives, we should not be pitting sector against sector, and we should be unequivocally saying that Canadian industry is the best in class, and that all of this is on the same path of development. And that's why it makes no sense for governments to be implementing public policies to punish, the best in class in conventional oil and gas, while also trying to maintain this narrative that they want to lead into the future of the development of renewable and alternative technologies, because in fact, this is the same in Canada.